sometimes in life, you just need a second chance. What does that look like? Or perhaps you just got cut from a sports team. Somebody will pick you up, I promise you that. Or perhaps your significant other just dumped you. You will find somebody else, I can promise you that as well. Or perhaps you're the railroad station behind me. Hi, this is Trevor from History on the Move, and behind me is Mount Royal Station, right here in downtown Baltimore. And we are going to take you all over this thing, inside, outside, all around, and we have some very special guests that are going to enlighten us as to the history of this thing and the architecture style. So sit back, grab your favorite cup of coffee, tea, juice, whatever the heck you're drinking these days, and enjoy this and have just as much fun watching this as I had making it for you. So how do we get to this Mount Royal Station? Why is it constructed in the heart of Baltimore? Well, let's get into that. So the year is 1890, and the B&O has a problem. What problem is that? Well, they're competing against the Pennsylvania Railroad for the trackage and the number of passengers and the fares that bring those people from New York down to DC. And the B&O realized at the time, hey, look, we're trying to get through the heart of Baltimore, and we're having to take essentially car floats, put the trains on car floats and take them from Canton to Locust Point, and this is horrendously uneconomical. We can do better. And so fast forward, and we're not going to get into all the details here, but this is where the Baltimore Beltline, the Howard Street Tunnel, comes into the mix. So before Mount Royal, the only station in Baltimore is Camden Station, and Camden's in a bit of a, we'll call it, industrial area, and so there's, people had to really make their way there. It was a long trip, especially if you lived out here in the Mount Royal area or north of here. So this is where the B&O got created, and they said, look, we are going to tunnel through Baltimore, and we will make sure that we have a station roughly halfway through this tunneling area, and this is where we get Mount Royal. So that tunneling takes from the roughly the end of 1890 until the very beginnings of 1896. And again, that's the Baltimore Beltline. And we'll again cover that in another video. That's a great video actually to cover in the future. We'll get there. But so they began constructing this in 1894, the end of 1894. And this is by our beloved E. Francis Baldwin. So if you've been to the B&O Railroad Museum, you've walked through that roundhouse? Yeah, that's his. Have you seen Camden Warehouse downtown? Right, the backdrop of Oriole Park at Camden Yards? Yeah, that's E. Francis too. He's all over the place. There are a myriad of them, and he's another separate video that we'll do in the future. But again, let's not digress. So E. Francis Baldwin and Josiah Pennington end up putting their brains together, and this is what you get. And it's a phenomenal building, and we're going to get you a tour of the outside and the inside, so stay tuned for that. But the rough dimensions of this are 250 feet long by 53 feet wide. And the clock tower you see is 150 feet tall. The train shed, now originally the train shed here behind me was 400 feet. But in 1936, these trains were getting longer, and so they eventually had to lengthen the shed. They added on. And so, and it sits in a roughly 4-acre bowl, if you will. Now, here's the fun part about why is it in this bowl, if you will, right? Everything else is above grade. Why is it in a bowl? Well, so the B&O's coming through here and they're tunneling, and they had two choices. You could either make the station at track level, so up here, and the tracks are down here, or sorry, the tracks are down here and the station is up top and you have to take stairs to get to it, or you make it at track level and you're already there. Well, the Pennsylvania Railroad already did that. They made their station up top and you went down the stairs to the track level. So it was above grade. And that's how passengers that were riding the Pensy would get in and out of Baltimore. Now, the B&O said, you know what, this might be kind of a harebrained scheme, but you know what, let's just carve out a massive bowl, if you will, into this Mount Royal area, and we'll go ahead and plop this station here. So again, it starts in 1894, and the construction takes roughly 2 years, and it opens on September 1st, 1896. The contractors are J.J. Walsh and Son, and I did a little bit of digging, and man, their names are all over some building records. They were masons by trade. They did mostly concrete and stone and all that type of work. And so, again, they were all over the place. And sadly, though, sadly, the station would eventually close June 30th, 1961. But in the intermediary, right, between open and close, countless trains came through this place, countless trains. Mostly the Royal Blue and possibly sections of the Capital Limited. But again, piles, I mean, just massive, just sections of trains would come through here. This was a pretty heavily trafficked area. And people could either, again, get the train here if you lived in this more residential urban area, or you could take the walk and go down to Camden Station where you could get the train there. Now again, that's a bit of more of an industrial section, but those are the two options for Baltimore in terms of trains. So again, the passenger, as we know, history-wise, the passenger service begins to die out at the end of World War II. That's the beginning of the end. And eventually, airlines take over, and the highways and byways and the automobile is definitely on the rise. So, as passenger service kind of begins to die, the B&O says, okay, we're going to have to cut this thing loose. Like, we just can't do this anymore. And so eventually what happens is they shut the station down for good in 1961. And then it's basically just sitting here. It's forlorn, it's derelict. Vandals had gotten to it. And it wasn't until 1964 that Eugene Leake, who was the president of the Maryland Institute College of Art, better known as MICA, would step in and say, you know what, I think we can use this. This can be the heart of our campus. And so this is how we get to what we see today. And so they bought it in 1964, and fast forward to 1967, the renovation was completed. And so they put in literally a second floor here. I mean, we'll get into those details with James and Brian further on in the episode. But that is what you see today. And if you come down here, and I always encourage people to come and see this stuff in person for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Get out there and explore these things, because this is fascinating stuff. And here's some really cool stuff too, is you had some pretty heavy hitters coming through here, some big names. Presidents: Eisenhower, Coolidge, Hoover, FDR, some of the biggest names in just outside of the U.S. Cardinal James Gibbons, the Gibbons School, came through here. Queen Marie of Romania came through here on a train and stopped. And Ramsay MacDonald, who was the British Prime Minister in 1924, he also came through here. Yeah, how cool is that? And this is what we strive to do on this channel, is to bring this to life. But again, you come visit this for yourself.
You know it won't be too long till she meets the one who's seen it all before, shines warm like the morning sun. Are you having fun, or are you in despair? Are you indifferent, or do you even care? Now don't you get it confused, the heart is a tool, it was made to be used.
So as we mentioned, there are plenty of celebrities, this place is not short of them, that have come through these very doors. Buffalo Bill Cody, Enrico Caruso, the famous opera singer, just name a few, parked their cars right there on the sub-end switch. But guess who else came through this station and absolutely loved it and wrote about it? One Lucius Beebe. Oh yeah, Beebe and Clegg were just absolutely synonymous with railroad photography. They pretty much pioneered the three-quarter shot. But instead of me talking about Beebe, why don't we let him tell us what he thought about Mount Royal?
One of the celebrated railroad stations of the world. ranking in renown with Euston, London, scene of so many Sherlock Holmes departures, the Gare du Nord in Paris as the feudal fortress of the Pennsylvania at Broad Street, Philadelphia, the Baltimore and Ohio's Mount Royal Depot at Baltimore never moved out of the 19th century, and nobody wanted it to. It's porte cochere, derived from an age when horse cabs were the accepted agency of local transport, and primordial steam radiators, rocking chairs, and folksy atmosphere gently maintain continuity with yesterday, even as diesel power snarled in the covered train shed outside.
So we've moved to the outside of the station here, and we're gonna actually take you inside. It's not a view that a whole lot of people get to see, but if you remember James from the channel, James, tell them about yourself.
Well, I happen to be a student here at the Maryland Institute College of Art, which owns the Mount Royal Station. I'm studying sculpture. So I have the unique position of having access to the building, and I can show you all around.
And who else better to show us and talk to us about the interior and the design of the time frame than my good buddy Brian Davis. You probably remember him from the Washington observation car video. Tell us about yourself there, Brian.
Well, I am not a student at Maryland Institute College of Art. We'll get that out of the way for. but I am something of an armchair architectural historian and enthusiast, and I've worked for years in the antiques trade. So I've got some knowledge on period styles and design. So that's why I'm going to join the gentleman here and talk about the architectural design elements of Mount Royal Station.
And with that, let's take you inside so you can see what the heck we're being talking about.
So the Mount Royal Station, where we're standing, as mentioned, was first built in 1896. It served as the B&O's passenger station for the new sort of streetcar suburbs being built in what was at the time the northern part of Baltimore. You're thinking, like, if you know anything about Baltimore, that's Bolton Hill, Mount Vernon, these sort of areas. It closed in, I believe, 58?
1961.
1961, yeah. 1961, it stood abandoned for a number of years. 1964, the Maryland Institute College of Art bought it for $250,000, which was about 50% of its actual market value. Spent $650,000 transforming it into what it is now, which is a art gallery, academic space, and studio space. And that's how we'll see it today. This was a fairly extensive renovation. They actually added a second floor to the main hall of the station, which originally would have just been a very large vaulted sort of double-story structure. And so we're just going to kind of take you through, and Brian and I will talk about some of the historic features of the building and kind of give you an inside tour of a building that I don't think a lot of people get to see the inside of these days. So where we're standing now, this is actually the exterior of the building. You can see the same granite walls that we're familiar with. These doorways here, this would have been an exterior door leading out to where we're standing now. Where we're standing now actually would have been the platform originally. There's an original wooden roof over where we're standing. These walls on the right side going down the hallway, these are all new. These were added in the 60s during the renovation of the building. And this would have all been open to the tracks, and there would have been just a fence and then the platform beyond that. So going into this area here, this is one of the, I'm not sure exactly what this room would have been. I suspect some of these areas to the north and south of the main waiting area were offices. They were administrative rooms, baggage areas, that sort of thing. Walking through here, you can actually see some of the original, up here you can see the original tin ceiling. We can get a closer look at that later, along with this big cast iron column. And here, this is one of the original radiators. So these were installed, notably a railroad, I don't know if historian, certainly enthusiast, Lucius Beebe at the time, wrote about these exact radiators. And these would have been used, obviously, to heat the space. I don't know, Brian, if you want to talk a little bit about
what I wanted to point out on the radiator, and this is something that's, the Victorians liked to ornament everything. And even though a radiator's job is to heat the building, it's still got this really attractive decorative grill work on top that really, it has no function other than to finish off the aesthetic. And it's kind of telling as well that they put the radiator around the base of the iron column. It kind of integrates two different functional elements of the building, a structural and environmental. So that's interesting. That would have been quite advanced at the time, you know. And I was in England at Ely Cathedral, and they had very similar radiators to these that were probably installed there around the same time this station was built in the late 1890s.
And one thing, you can see the steam pipes just go into the floor. This whole building was built because it's sort of this low, sort of depressed bowl below street level. This whole building is just built on one big slab. That includes the platform, that includes the baggage areas to the south. The other thing I'd like to point out is that this area now, this is actually the senior studios for the sculpture department. But one thing I'd like to point out is if we come around here, you can see there's these all along the building, there's these kind of famous double doors, you know, these big glass doors. And up here, there's these transom windows. And of course, before you had air conditioning, these would have been really important. You could open all of these windows up and get a really nice cross breeze running across here, cooling everything off and making it habitable during the summer. And of course, you see that radiator keeping it warm during the winter.
This room is really interesting because even though it's been converted to classroom space, we have quite a bit of the old station here.
Yes, you got the mosaic tile floor. This would have been all throughout the waiting area. You can see over there, Brian kind of has that.
Yeah, we have a great Greek key border in the tile. And the tile itself is in a rusticated style. Mm-hmm. Like if you notice, each little mosaic piece is not set perfectly, and that's intentional. That was meant to give a sort of overall visual effect, and also ties into the vaguely Romanesque style of the exterior.
Moving over here, you can actually see in the floor here where the one of the old radiators used to sit. You can see there's kind of might be a little hard to see on camera, but there's certainly a circle in the floor where I think the floor was probably repaired. Then Brian, if you want to talk about that little...
Yeah, and we've been discussing these, and as near as we can tell, the medallion, and there are several throughout the building, were just there to relieve the big expanse of mosaic tile. It was simply a decorative, device, so that it was not just a big tile sea in the middle of the building. Although there is this little bronze medallion, and I do not know if it had a purpose or again was just to provide a little spot of metallic brightness in the middle of this tile work and the marble. But anyway, it's an interesting remnant of the building from 1896 that is still visible today.
One thing I'd like to point out as well is above us you can see there's this kind of more modern ceiling, very industrial looking. This was put in during the 60s when the building was renovated. This originally would have gone all the way up both floors. So this would have been a much kind of more cavernous, vaulted space. And this ceiling was put in to allow for the creation of a second floor. You can see also as well that there's more of these windows here, these big doorways. Same thing with the transom windows. Those could be opened up and allow for air to come through here. Interestingly, behind this wall here, originally when the building was built, there were large fireplaces actually at either end of the building. So right here there would have been, and I don't know if it still exists behind this wall or if it was taken out, but there would have been a big fireplace here, and that would have gone up to one of those chimneys, those big decorative chimneys that you can see looking at the exterior of the building. Okay, so we're now at the south end of what was once the main waiting area. This is another classroom. We were at the north end before, and you can see this is much the same mosaic tile floor. Behind us, you can see that there's kind of a trench. I believe there's some electrical or water lines that were put through here. The remains of what used to be another one of those medallions is on the floor there. This is the same as the other room in that the ceiling was lowered and a second floor was put in during the renovation in the 60s to create more classroom space. Another medallion here, and then the room behind me, which is sadly locked and I don't have the key for it, there was at one point a lunch counter during the 40s and 50s. Before that, there was actually a fireplace in a wall behind here. So there was a large fireplace at either end. the waiting area, fairly symmetrical as the classrooms are now. And you can actually see in the floor the remains of that lunch counter. And interestingly, if you look right here, you can also see where another one of those radiators once was in that kind of circular patch that's been put in the floor. All right, so where we're standing now is what is now the metal shop for MICA. And this was actually, where we're standing right now is behind both the classroom we were just in and behind the original exterior of the building. So you can see the stone wall here. This was closed in during the 60s, but this was originally, the roof you can see above us is original. You can see this kind of wood tug and groove roof up here, and this would have been the platform where people would have waited for their trains, the baggage area where baggage was sorted and moved around. This was closed in to create this, the shop that we're in right now. But moving back along this wall, you can see there's a doorway there, and there's another doorway right here. Now where we're going into now, this was originally, I believe, a kitchen space for that snack bar that I mentioned before, the lunch counter. This whole room here, at some point this probably started as offices, was converted later on. That snack bar was put in and judging by its design, I would say probably the 40s. And you can see here, there's this linoleum floor. You see right there, that's definitely 30s, 40s linoleum. That's pretty old right there. It's been painted over. This is now a room in which plaster and wax and that sort of thing is mixed and molded. But these are definitely very interesting spaces we're moving through. That's an original plaster wall over there, and behind that wall would have been the fireplace that I mentioned earlier. So we're moving out from behind the metal shop where we just were, this enclosed space. Originally, all of this would have been open, as I was just saying. This would have been sort of the platform where people would have waited, where baggage would have been sorted. We're moving out to behind the metal shop. This is sort of a storage area, a kind of a continuation of that metal shop space. This is for things that you don't really want to have inside, like forges, that sort of thing. Along this wall here, you can see this fence. This is the original fence. Originally, this has been moved about 10 feet closer to the modern day tracks. Originally, this would have been in between these pillars that we see here. You can see there's that big I-beam pillar behind this large ventilation system that's been installed. Looking down at the ground, you can actually see that there is a track. Now, this track would have gone up fairly close to the platform, still inside the train shed. It would have gone all the way up down to the tunnel there. This was really a stub track where engines, that sort of thing, could be stored if necessary. Now, moving along this fence here, you can see this is really, none of it's welded. This is just sort of an interesting thing if you're interested in metal fabrication. It's all riveted together. So that's really a hallmark. You can tell this was very much turn of the century, before arc welding became super common. Now, looking actually here, you can see it's been welded together right there. But originally you can see these large gaps, and that's where it would have attached to those big I-beams there. Those are probably, I would say, maybe 8 inches wide or so, and there's big 8-inch gaps. We're actually in the train shed right now, underneath it. Now, this train shed a lot of this was redone actually in the 80s, so the wood, a lot of that was replaced. And this is really a hallmark of this station. I mean, this beautiful wrought iron work coming over here, these really nice arched shapes, very much a characteristic of the B&O's Mount Royal. So we're actually standing right now in what is now the digital fabrication machine shop in MICA. This is like we have our CNC machines, that sort of thing. But originally, before this was enclosed in the 60s, this would have been an open area. I believe this is where the baggage was sorted. You can see this really big kind of trussed iron structure going over our heads, this original wooden roof with this sort of, I don't know if you can see, but there's this sort of tug and groove pattern in there. And this goes all the way across and goes behind the building to the train shed. And this is where luggage could be brought in, sorted out, brought out to trains But it's this very open space on the same level as the platform and everything else.
All right, so here we are in the portion of the building that is the closest to what a traveler would have seen when this is still a railroad station, and there's a lot of original architectural detail here. Again, we have the mosaic floor, such as we saw elsewhere, and if you notice, we've got a transition from the mosaic to modern vinyl tile, and this is where the ticket office used to stand. The ticket window would have been here, but I'd like to just point out several details. Like, the exterior of the building is Romanesque, by and large, with strong Renaissance elements. But in the interior, we'll get just a little bit more eclectic. Yes, there are Romanesque elements, like we've got these big round columns. You'll notice they don't taper. They're just perfectly cylindrical. And Victorian architects were not at all averse to borrowing different styles from different historical periods and mixing and matching them. So while we do have a very Roman sort of egg and dart on the capital of the column, there are also French fleur-de-lis. So there's that. But then if we look up, we then have a very traditional Romanesque arcade with half-round arches, but then the ceiling itself is coffered, more Renaissance, a little more ornate than Romanesque architecture would normally have. Traditional, when I say Romanesque in this case, I'm not meaning Romanesque revival from the Victorian period. I'm talking about original 11th and 12th century Romanesque architecture that was noted for its massiveness and simplicity inside and out. But there were some interesting cost savings. Like, B&O wanted the station to be grand, but they still had to mind their pennies. The ornate ceiling is stamped tin, not carved wood. And we do have beautiful wainscoting, but it's oak. It's not mahogany, it's not walnut. And even though oak is a high quality wood, it was a more affordable choice. And you probably have noticed some of the very non-railroad things in this room, and James can explain a little bit of what's going on here.
This is actually an art gallery. There's an exhibition up right now. I would like to point out, of course, this is as Brian said, this is the closest to its original state. Of course, the entirety of the building, you can see through these windows here, would have been this very high vaulted sort of structure. This, of course, was the original main entrance. Through these doors, you can see actually the archway that carriages and later cars would have been able to come through to drop off passengers. Looking at the floor, you can see there's another one of these decorative elements, of course, some of these art pieces on top of it. And it actually matches very closely to the size and shape of some of the columns. You can see these here. So it creates a very nice sort of visual symmetry. It's really in the center of these four columns and kind of creates sort of a phantom fifth column. That's nice. I'd also like to point out that you can see these open arches on this side of the room. Both sides of the building would have been, both sides of the space, rather, would have been identical. So these would have been open, and these were filled in at a later date, I believe, when this room in this building was renovated to create a room behind those columns.
So this is interesting because this is one of the original light fixtures. This is visible in historic photos of the depot. And one of the things that is interesting about it is it was not a gas light. It was made as an electric fixture. So they were quite advanced in having electric lighting in 1896. So earlier we talked about some of the ways that costs were saved in the construction of this building. And on the exterior, we have a lot of decorative elements that are made of carved stone. On the interior, they are mostly made of plaster. And you can see we've got some damage here, so you can see the raw edge of the plaster from which this capital was cast. And if we back up a little bit, we're actually standing on a floor that was added later. So we're standing up at what would have been the ceiling level of an original two-level space. And stamped tin, and the dental molding and egg and dart molding there also stamped tin. Again, we would think of that as a fairly costly thing to do today, but in 1896, that was a less expensive way to get an ornamental ceiling without paying to do carved wood or gilding or anything like that. And it's painted white now. I'll wager that it probably had an antique gold finish to it when it was new, but that's just my conjecture based on other buildings of this period I've been in. So do take that with a grain of salt. I don't have any confirmation, but I'm willing to bet that it was.
Where we're standing now, While we're still on the second floor and in other parts of the building that we were just showing that was added later on during the 60s renovation, this is one of the few parts of the second floor that is actually original. This would have been office space, and downstairs in the same area, office space, rooms for baggage handlers, the kitchen that I mentioned earlier. Above us, probably storage, perhaps more office space. And as well on the other end, in this same sort of, if you're familiar with the floor plan of Mount Royal Station, there are two sort of square sections of the building on either end. We're in the southmost one. On the northmost one, I believe it probably would have been similar usage. Where we're standing right now, this is the staircase leading up to the room we just showed you. This is how the station master, anybody else, would have gotten to their offices on the second floor and to the third floor as well. And up there, there's a large storage space, the same on the other side of the building.
So we're up in an attic space now, and today it serves as a sculpture class studio, but because it was an attic space, it's not finished, and it really tells a story about how the building was constructed. So if we look through the window, you can see the granite that faces the exterior of the building, but pulling back, we've got rough brickwork. And in today's world, everyone likes to make a big deal out of exposed brick, but in the Victorian period, unless the brick was laid very elegantly with very fine masonry joints, it wasn't meant to be shown off. So that's why it's exposed up here in an attic. This is just rough structural brickwork, and its only job is holding up the wall. And then if we look over here, we can see the trusses that support the roof, and they're made out of really heavy, massive timbers. And it is interesting, though, that we've got a wooden truss, but it looks like steel tubular. I suppose it would be a king post. I'm a little rusty on my truss terminology, but regardless, this gives an idea of the bones of this very elegant Victorian building, the stuff that actually holds it up, not so much the pretty things that you see when you're in the public spaces of the exterior.
Wagging tail, the pride of Baltimore barks at the mailman. You know she never would bite, likes to keep you warm at night. She'll be a man's best friend if you just learn to treat her right. Yeah, there's a million things I love about her. Ain't nothing that I don't. Nothing that I wouldn't do, ain't nothing that I won't. Oh.
All right, so we're standing here along the staircase in the entranceway of Mount Royal Station. Behind us is Mount Royal Avenue, and you can see that this structure goes all the way to street level. So obviously, when people were coming in their carriages and their cars, they could be dropped off right here and walk under shelter all the way down these stairs and get to their train on time.
And there's a lot of original ironwork and detail here. We have Corinthian columns, and if you look, even this bracket is ornamental, and we've got lovely scroll work on the railings. Of course, they've added some additional ironwork for security, but it's this is an interesting part of this station and its history, because the station is built well below street level. So this was how passengers, or one way passengers, could access the station. There's also, of course, the porte cochere where we were standing at the beginning of the video, but many pedestrian passengers enter Mount Royal Station this way.
And it's also worth noting that at the time of the station's building and when it was in service, there was actually a identical stairway on the other side of the station, which is no longer there, allowing people to enter from, I believe, Howard Street, and that would allow them to come from either side and also come down the parking lot into the main entrance at the front.
Now don't you get it confused, the heart is a tool, it was made to be used. Well, whatever is coming, or whatever it is, wherever we go at the end of when we live,
Okay, folks, so we moved to the upper part of the station, as you can see behind me, to one of the main stairwells here. And you may look at this behind me and go, I don't really know what I'm looking at. Guess what? I have two very special guests that know a lot more about this and are going to walk around this building with me. This is my good friend Tim. Tim, tell the people in YouTube land who you are.
Hi, I'm Tim Pula, and I am the great-grandson of Ephraim Francis Baldwin, the architect of this very fine building. I studied architecture. I did not get his talents, urban planning, and I've spent the last 30 years doing real estate development work in Baltimore.
And my good friend Beth, tell the people in YouTube land who you are.
I'm Beth Baldwin Hokeworth, and I'm also a great-grandchild of E. Francis Baldwin, and I'm Tim's cousin. And I was a CFO for a commercial real estate development company. So I think both Tim and I got a little bit of the building side in our genes, even though we don't design.
So the key here is if they were to go and donate blood, it would say E. Francis
Yes.
Baldwin on that vial.
Yes.
Let's go take a tour of the outside with them.
With the smiling eyes, beautiful soul, hips that were made for mind control.
Okay, so we've moved down the stairs now. Let's ask some questions and get some answers about Mount Royal Station. All right, Tim, so what are the main materials here that we're looking at? Talking about the main materials of which this is made from.
So the most prominent material is granite. It's a Maryland granite. There seems to be a little controversy over maybe exactly where it's from. The Baltimore Sun reported it being from Port Deposit, Maryland. Right. Other sources have said from Granite, Maryland, or Woodstock, Maryland, which is just west of the city. But it is a Maryland product, and that would make sense because shipping granite is not an easy thing to do. So if you're going to use it, you want it to be from as close a source as possible.
Okay. Talk about the window trimmings we see up here.
So first you've got other stone around the windows. That's an Indiana limestone. So different than the granite, which came from Maryland, it came from Indiana. So it was a time where they could actually ship something by rail on those long distances. If it was pre-railroad, that would have been really difficult to get from Indiana by horse and wagon, essentially.
And the supports we see for the lower roof here, what material are we looking at here? That looks more like iron.
So that's an iron. This would be probably a period where steel had started to be used, but it was still a relatively new material. So I think that's an iron
Definitely.
material.
Yeah, I can see the bolts and all.
And then you see, slate on this lower roof.
That's a slate roof, okay.
Up above, we have a clay tile roof, which is very Spanish and Romanesque. Not something you see a whole lot of here in Baltimore, but it's an incredibly durable material.
You and I were talking about this before. These little mini fences, we'll call them, at the very top, or at the very lower portion of the roof.
Right.
What is that?
So it's essentially a snow and ice guard, and they were meant to control and keep snow and ice that built up during storms from just sliding off and falling on people.
Okay.
You can imagine if from the upper roof, if it was covered with snow from a big storm, and as you have those days after a storm where the sun's hitting it,
Yes.
and it's starting to melt a little, and then it refreezes, you start getting ice, and if
ice
that
dams.
slides
That makes
off,
sense, yeah.
and you've got hundreds of people down coming and going
just
to
saw
get to the
pictures
train,
of
that
that.
can be very dangerous. So it was a common feature.
Okay. And the supports, so we're going back to the supports, they are iron, but they actually do support the roof, right? We were talking about this before. They come down and then they actually come into.
They do.
What do we call these pieces here on either side? these guys right here. They actually do support, right? Like they come down and they...
Right, so this piece of stone goes back into the wall. It's not just sitting here flush. It's a piece that goes back. It probably goes back, however thick this wall is, this stone probably goes that deep.
Gotcha.
Right, so it's obviously it's tied into the other stones with the mortar, so it is providing support, but you can see how this piece of this iron bracket also sits back. There's a slight indentation in the stone here, so this sits back in the stone, and then you can see tie rods that tie it back. So right above, it's hard to point to, but that's a tie rod, and that is tying back through the stone also. And then, these do come out, and interestingly, they just support this beam.
It's the main beam, essentially.
Right, and that beam then has these, smaller beams or purlins that rest on top of it, and so it's really supporting that beam that is the way this carries the weight of this roof, versus the roof decking sitting partially on top of the iron bracket.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, Tim, talk to me about why is this building built, one, of the materials that it is, and there's a very minimal use of wood.
So there are probably multiple reasons it was built of stone, and I would think that the main reason is that it's a very prominent civic building.
Yes.
And the tendency was to build prominent civic buildings of materials that showed strength and sustainability, not in terms of the way that we often think of that word today, and probably not a word that they were using, but it showed strength, robustness, and something that would last, right? So prominent civic and institutional buildings, stone was a common material. There were other train stations in the country being built with stone at the time. H.H. Richardson, the famous, a famous architect of that time, had been doing some stone railroad stations, and it appears that E.F. Baldwin was inspired in part by that. But fire protection certainly was also a concern. This predates the Great Baltimore Fire, but there were lots of other great urban fires that had occurred across the country throughout the 1800s. Chicago, New York, Boston, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, right? And it was a well-known issue and concern. So that's another reason for using the stone. And related to fire, the reality is that when this was first built, the trains coming through here were steam locomotives. They were powered by burning coal.
Right.
And burning that coal put not just a lot of smoke up into the air, but ash.
Right.
So, added protection. And obviously we talked very briefly, and we'll look at more. It's got a clay tile roof,
yes,
right? And that's part of the style, the Romanesque style, but it is also an inflammable material, right? So added, fire protection too in terms of the roof.
So wood-wise, exterior, we're only looking at really these doors and the framing of the windows. Is that right? I mean, that's
on the exterior,
yeah.
Yes. It's the windows and the trim around the windows. I'm sure there's more wood used internally, but again, primarily for doors. Probably some of the trim, say wainscoting, etc. Maybe walls. I don't, but it's a big building. There were big buildings built at this time that were made, using timber.
Right.
Other buildings that he did, for example, the B&O warehouse at Camden Yards. Mm-hmm. It's brick and timber, big timber beams and columns.
On the
on the inside that are the structure. So you could build a very prominent big building that had a lot of wood structure at the time. There were limitations of how high you could go. Right. And it really wasn't until iron and steel came around that you could go taller. But the stone is really, it's about the prominence of this type of building, civic, institutional building, a focal point, and
like
fire
longevity.
protection. Yes.
Showing longevity to the community.
Right. So I think, if you look around the area, you're not going to find many stone buildings.
No.
But there are some. So you've got 5th Regiment Armory, which is up until recently, I guess, home of the Maryland National Guard, which is just a stone's throw to the west here. A stone building,
No pun
almost
intended,
completely.
Stone's throw.
Correct. Not throwing this stuff, but it is a stone building, and of roughly the same era. It's like 5 to 10 years after this was built. You've got Corpus Christi Church up Mount Royal, which is a stone building. And that was pretty common. If you look around the city, many of the churches built at that time were built with stone. And of course, to the east of us, you have Penn Station, which is the main train station now. And that was also built with stone, although different. It wasn't granite. I believe it was a limestone. Now that stone was not necessarily structural. It was more of a cladding. It's, I think, has a steel structure and some concrete and very complicated concrete and tile flooring system.
Gotcha. So that stone was more beautification.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Whereas this has a very specific function, which is to support the whole building.
Wow.
But it also is done in a way to be very beautiful.
Yes. Very true. All right, Tim, explain to me. So this clock tower is 150 feet tall. We know that. But 2 questions here. Why is the balcony green? And why is the tower 150 feet?
Okay. So what you can't really see from this angle is the roof of the clock tower, which is a pitched roof, and it is covered with copper. So it is a copper metal roof. Okay. Very durable material, but copper patinas. We've all seen copper, kind of an orangish, reddish color. But once it's installed, it starts to weather and it develops a green patina to it. So what you see on these stone balconies is really staining from that green patina that develops on the copper roof. And over time, rain has taken some of that patina, the residue, and it has fallen down onto the stone balconies, and it's left a stain on those. So, I think it actually adds character.
So we said it was 150 feet. Now remember, we're inside of a bowl essentially here.
Right.
He's excavated that. But what purpose would a giant clock tower like this serve in a station that is below grade?
A couple things. Visibility, right? This was the way to say, to create a landmark and to say to people, hey, this is where the station is. But as we talked about earlier, this is a prominent civic building. So the tower was another way of expressing that, and calling attention to it. So it had to be tall enough to be visible from the surrounding areas. You mentioned that we're kind of sunken down here. This was excavated to get to this level, and the reason for that is the Howard Street Tunnel, which runs behind this, right? And those trains are coming out of a tunnel that runs under Howard Street. So the station had to be at the same elevation as those tracks. Today, that's all used for freight. but back when that tunnel was first constructed, it was used for both passenger and freight. So it's primarily about being visible and being able to call attention to the building, but also reinforcing the civic prominence of this building. I think there's also a very distinct relationship between the height of this building and the length of it.
Because we're talking about proportions here.
Right, we're talking about proportions, and you imagine if that tower was half as tall, it would look kind of weird relative to the overall length of the building.
Right.
And it would look too squat, so it's about prominence, calling attention, being visible, but it's also in really great relationship with the overall length of the building and the height of the two main floors.
Okay, now let's also, since we backed up a little bit here, Tim, talk to me about this tile. This is clay tile or red tile?
It's some type of clay tile. It could be terracotta, which is a type of clay tile. Don't know exactly, but it is a tile roofing material that dates back centuries. You could find it in buildings throughout Italy and through all sorts of parts of Europe.
Hence
but
the Renaissance influence of the station.
It fits with Romanesque Renaissance styles that influenced the design of this building. And it's a very, very durable material. It's a fireproof material. We already talked about how, part of the idea behind the stone was fire protection, because fires had been a major problem in big cities across the country. So it's another piece of that.
Right?
The snow guards are on these roofs too.
And then if we pan down here, talk to me. So from what you and I have been able to look at of time period postcards and photos, we can almost safely surmise that what you see is not completely original brick. Obviously it's been replaced. We can see
Correct.
down here the really bright red stuff. But this would have been all brick all the way up.
Yeah, the photos we've seen, it looks like this was all brick. I think it's a pretty good assumption that a lot of this is the original brick.
Right.
Asphalt was not a very common material, if even available at all. If you went through other parts of the city, you would have found, cobblestone streets, other brick streets. I was recently in a part of Canton where they were milling and repaving the street. So they're stripping the asphalt, right, and putting down new asphalt.
Okay.
And it uncovered brick. The entire street had been done in brick. The brick looked better than any asphalt I'd seen. It was like they should have just taken the asphalt off and left the brick. I think this is likely original, and had it not been this, it probably would have been a cobblestone. This was likely easier to make. Cheaper probably. Cobblestones were all hand carved in some form. It wasn't like there was a mold that was just churning out cobblestone. It's actual natural stone that had to be cut and chiseled to those shapes and sizes, which took time and labor. Brick was there was a manufacturing process, a standardized process for making them. You can make more of them more quickly, cheaper. I think these are likely original. There's probably never cobblestone here.
Yeah. And we're going to butcher this, porte cochere, right? Is that where?
Porte cochere.
Porte cochere. They would have built this obviously 1896. They were still traveling by horses and buggy and whatnot. I assume, is it safe to assume then that this thing called the automobile was not really on their minds back then, because it didn't come into prominence until the 20s and 30s, or at least didn't begin the climb. So this would have probably been used to, as you came into the station, right? You have to do this big loop.
Right. You would have done a loop around, and your carriage would have pulled in there, and that's where you would have disembarked, or either gotten out and gone into the station, or come out of the station and gotten into your carriage. And it provided cover. I think it's a French term, porte cochere. It meant like coachman's door, something along those lines. And you could drive a car through there, right? You could still use this today with a car, maybe not a big monster SUV.
Plot twist, guys. I actually did that last week, and I drove through it with the truck.
And you see things like this done still today at buildings, hotels, right? Often have a canopy. Not, and that canopy can just be something that is cantilevered over an entryway where you can pull up and get out and not be in the weather.
Right. But if you go to the Holiday Inn these days, there is no coachman that's coming out.
No, no. Some of the
just very unique time period pieces here that we, to kind of wrap all this up. So.
And my eyes made up, got my feelings so strong. I love her so deep, I love her so long. Now don't you get it confused, the heart is a tool, it was made to be
So if you've been a fan of this channel for any length of time, or perhaps you're new here, thanks for finding us. This is a segment of every episode, just about every episode, that we do called Cite Your Sources. And where does that come from? Well, I used to have a history professor long ago named Dr. Robert Rook. And I used to sit there in his office and have historical discussions with him. And, I'd make some kind of argument. And he'd say, Trevor, that's great, but you need to cite your sources. I say, okay. And I'd cite my sources. So for this episode, there was a plethora, big words, right? Plethora of sources here in which for you to go out there and find and comb through for yourself. And I will say one of the main ones I go back to for anything E. Francis Baldwin is the Carlos P. Avery book right here. E. Francis Baldwin, architect, the B&O Baltimore and beyond. This is a phenomenal read. Rest in peace, Carlos Avery, but man, you did a phenomenal job. And this particular copy actually came from Beth Baldwin Hockworth herself. She handed it to me right before the episode. So thanks, Beth, for doing that. But again, this is an amazing book. You should probably own at least one copy if you are a fan of anything E. Francis Baldwin. So if you want to talk about railroad stations in and of themselves, there's really just great books out there. The Railroad Station by Carl L. Meeks. This is pretty much a standard. There are many, many out there that will try to compare, but this is a solid one. Cannot recommend. Cannot recommend it enough, I should say. Great American Railroad Stations. There's a great write-up in here about E. Francis Baldwin and Mount Royal. And I highly recommend you go looking for this. This also had some really good details in it as well. Railroad Stations, The Buildings That Link the Nation by David Naylor is another solid book. You can't go wrong with that. Lots of good pictures, plenty of good photos in that one. So Mr. Naylor, you nailed it. The Architecture of Baltimore. This one's very near and dear to me. I really enjoyed this one. This was edited by Mary Ellen Hayward and Frank R. Shivers. So Hayward and Shivers did a phenomenal job on this one. There is a lot of good stuff in here. Again, not just railroad stuff. This is just Architecture of Baltimore, as the name implies, all over the place. So this had a really good write-up in here about all things B&O right here in Baltimore. And something else that was just about Mount Royal and the history itself, which I found very good, was this in the Sentinel magazine, which is the magazine that the Baltimore and Ohio, the B&O Railroad Historical Society publishes for their members. There's a great write-up in the, the spring 2019 edition, or the second quarter as they call it, and David Pfeiffer is the guy that wrote this article, and this is really good. So Mr. Pfeiffer, if you're watching this, heck of a good job, my friend. There's other ones out there too. You can go out there, and if you want to know more about the Royal Blue line itself, the gold standard, absolute gold standard, is Herbert H. Harwood, Royal Blue line. Cannot say enough good things, just phenomenal. You must read it. Just, Mr. Harwood is amazing. And there's other avenues for you to go out there. There's historical documents you can go find. There are things like the Historic American Engineering Records. These are all out there on the interwebs. And I'll put a link to a few of these down there for you in the description box there. But there are some really good ones out there, you know, that engineering firms and different government entities have gone out to do surveys and note different things about this stuff for preservation. So, but look, I'm not here to tell you where in the world to buy this stuff, but please just buy your books. Don't steal them. And if you borrow them from somebody, please return them. Nobody likes books that just, you know, pop, 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 and they just walk away and then never come home. Homeless books are not fun books. So make sure that you read your sources, but be very definitive in the sources that you read. Wow. We really learned a lot about the inside and the outside and the history of Mount Royal Station. I really hope you enjoyed this. This was a phenomenal episode, and one that gets us outside and moving, as the channel implies, on the move. And so, this is a great story of how something was repurposed. It got a second chance, right? And so big thanks to Tim for coming out here and giving us a great architectural walk around at the outside. Beth, thank you just from the bottom of my heart, both of you, for coming out and doing this episode. And as always, big thanks to Brian Davis for coming out here, and man, I cannot say enough, you really know your stuff, and the enthusiasm is amazing. And big thanks to James, and if you've watched this channel, you know James is in a few other episodes, and he's coming back. But big thanks to James for getting us inside the station to be able to see what it is now, and more importantly, how it was not retro, but how it was pushed into different service. And it's just a phenomenal thing. And again, yeah, you're not going to see the Royal Blue passenger train stopping there. There won't be any passenger trains stopping through there probably ever again, but guess what? It's still here, and it's still in its basically original state from the outside, so we have to appreciate that. So this is Trevor from History on the Move. You get out there and you read history, explore history, but most importantly, you make your own history. I'll see you on the next one.